So hello and welcome everybody. Whatever time it is with you, it's early-ish in the morning here in the UK. Will Beale speaking. I'm based up near Liverpool. I work for WWF and I'm also on the board of CMP. Welcoming you to this session on lighter approaches to the conservation standards. Vinaya, would you just like to say hello as well?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Vinaya Swaminathan. I work with Foundations of Success. I'm also based in the UK, in Leicester, in the East Midlands.
Great, and welcome to everybody wherever you are based today. So we'll just start by saying the statement to acknowledge territories and elders that we've been saying at the start of these rally sessions. So we acknowledge past, present, and emerging Indigenous and traditional custodians, elders, and ancestral spirits of the territories where we live and work. So hello, and with that, we'll move to our session, lighter approaches to the conservation standards. And the objectives for this session is, I know some of you will know something, have been involved and or been interested in this topic of lighter conservation standards. At some point, we've called it easy conservation standards as well. But anyway, it's an effort to develop some newish product and newish framing to support people and support users. And this initiative has been around for a few months in a more accelerated sense, with particular effort and resources going into it over the last while. So we've got to the point now that there is actual product or draft product for you to have a look at. And your feedback today will really help the initiative to move forward. So what we'll do, we've just been through some introductions, at least for a couple of us, and thanks to the rest of you for joining, of course. The other day, in fact, we had, I think, about 55 participants overall maximum, so it was quite a big group, but we had more facilitators that day, so it was fairly easy to manage. We'll probably be splitting into two groups later today in breakouts to discuss some of the products. So we'll give a bit of a nice overview of the initiative, and then Vinaya will take you through some drafts of product that we have that you can take a look at and give some feedback on, hopefully. And then we'll pull all that together later in the day for some overall reflections on what that might mean, ways that we might like to go for the future, and talk about next steps. And there is an evaluation form as well, which if you can fill in, that would be really appreciated too. Okay, so just as a bit of sort of fun really, and get you going, and also get you going using boards. Vinaya has put a link there in the chat of this presentation sheet. So if you can just click on that link, and this is a 2x2 grid, which you can use to choose a combination of things. So you can choose between apples and bananas, and you can choose between coffee and tea. So the idea is just to pick up a sticky from the left-hand side. So if you can try and do that with your mouse and move it across, you can choose any color you like, move it across to any of the places on the grid that express your preferences. Yeah, you can put your name on if you want. It's entirely up to you.
When I click on that link, all I do is get taken back to the presentation. Is that right?
It did that for me too. So if you just move through the presentation onto slide 4.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but it did that for me too. But I don't know. It's a funny thing sometimes, isn't it? How these things work.
That's right.
I just put in another link that should hopefully take you directly.
Oh,
to
okay,
slide
directly.
4.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that.
No. Okay, it seems to be that people can click on the links and it's working all right. I don't know if that's 21, but that's most people anyway. And there's a bit of a trend towards the right-hand side, towards the bananas rather than apples, and maybe probably towards coffee rather than tea. So top right certainly fairly popular. Anyway, that's just really a bit of fun. It expresses a little bit about people's preferences maybe and ways to engage with things, which is part of our topic together. And also it's also about being situational. Sometimes people might think, well, it depends on the time of day. It depends on whether I'm having breakfast or lunch or dinner or somewhere in between. So, and that's, again, part of the theme of today is responding and being situational, depending on what the particular topic or timing or status is of what we've got to deal with. Okay, so we'll go on. Okay, Vinaya, there we go. So just to say who our team is, so this is an initiative where we are trying to collaborate between CMP and CCNet, like many of the other collaborative learning initiatives that we have. And the members of the team are primarily from Foundations of Success. So you'll see that Vinaya is on there, also Armando, Marcia, Ashley, and Caroline. You may well know several of these people, and also myself. So we've been collaborating particularly as a group, and the way this was managed actually was we put it out. So once we decided we want to put some resources into this, we put it out to tender to ask for bids for who would like to do it. And FOS put a bid in, which was strong, and we supported them to go forward. But I'm engaging with them particularly as someone interested in this topic and as a member of the CMP and CCNet boards to try and help move it forwards. Okay. All right. So this is just to give you a bit of an overview of the objectives in a bit more detail about this and where we're up to in the process. So again, yes, some of you may have engaged with this already, but for those who haven't so much, the problem we're trying to address is that some users, some people, practitioners, coaches, users, they maybe choose not to use the conservation standards, or they struggle with it, or they don't like aspects of it because they find the process or they perceive it as being a complex and time-consuming process. And they think it's only going to work if you've got maybe a team with a lot of time and money, or a situation which allows you for that. So that may or may not be the case, and we might disagree with that comment, but there are some perceptions around like that. And certainly sometimes to get into the process for a newer user, it can seem like quite a lot to engage with before you even start the process. So the purpose of this initiative is to develop and provide conservation standards materials in an accessible way that addresses some of these concerns and comes very much from a user perspective and thinks, okay, if I was a user coming into this, how could I try and engage with it and get into it in a relatively straightforward way. So users of what we anticipate as products could be coaches or project managers or teams who already are familiar with the conservation standards, but we can help them to be more effective and efficient in guiding people to appropriate material or appropriate approaches. And equally, the tools could be useful for newer users to help them understand the conservation standards, to be thoughtful about how to engage with them depending on their situation. So what do we mean by lighter conservation standards? So yes, we are talking about simplifying the process for the project team, not necessarily for the coach. I mean, the coaches might already be able to deal with the whole range from simple to complex anyway. But for teams, we'd like to do something around keeping all the elements. So we see all the elements of the conservation standard cycle as being important, but offering maybe simpler tools or ways of dealing with the process to manage things in a doable way, even in relatively straightforward situations or depending on what the context is. So that might be, for example, that sometimes you can just identify the priority of top risks rather than doing a very full comprehensive risk analysis, just as one example. And then we want to be able to explain clearly or give some guidance on what sort of tools or processes to use under what circumstances, again, being situational, as we've talked about. Clarifying what's more recommended versus absolutely must-haves, and be using language that's appropriate to different audiences or to this sort of target audience. And again, in terms of language, maybe sometimes emphasizing the basic principles or the thing we're aiming for rather than a tool itself. So yes, as an example, there's talk about understanding the situation rather than you must do a situation model. Which again, we've never said that you must do a situation model is something you have to do, but it can come across that way sometimes. And then finally, I mean, and this is, again, it's a combination of things, of course, of written evidence and people, but sometimes it is about relying on using the skills, the knowledge of people around sometimes, as well as detailed sources of evidence. So of course, it's a combination. And where we are in the process, we're currently in the product development phase, actually. So indeed, that started a little bit before that, December 21. So after the scoping and some initial outreach, and you may have been engaged in some of that already and provided some feedback or indeed some products, and that's really, really appreciated to those of you and many others not on this call who have provided examples of trying to deal with this sort of situation from their context. So that's been great. Foundation Success have been looking at all those materials, having conversations about it, and have got to this stage, as I say, of producing some draft products. And today and the other day and further on from this are opportunities to provide community input into those drafts, which will then enable FOS to go forward with finalizing products. And then there is a guidance committee or a committee on reviewing guidance, which you might be aware of for CMP and CCNet as well. And that committee will be interested to see the product a bit later in the process in 22. Okay, Vinay, over to you.
Great, thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that setup. I'm just going to take a minute to walk you through some of the draft products that have been under development over the last several weeks, and then transition us over into our breakout groups to really dive into some of those mock-ups and get your feedback. So a couple of you, maybe many of you, may have seen that we did send out a survey. We did a survey back in September, and we heard from 57 people, 57 respondents, including many of you, so thank you for your input. And we basically used the survey as an opportunity to gauge interest and demand for a lighter version of the conservation standards, or lighter options for the conservation standards. And in that survey, we summarized the results, and you can see in the graph on the right here, basically bottom line, what this graph is saying is that people by and large saw a need for lighter options, and that the lighter options could be appropriate for all of the steps, all 5 steps in the conservation standards. And we also got great input on some examples of adapted products and tools that are sort of on the lighter edge, a lighter touch. We got good input on resources, as well as tips and insights on how to go about setting up lighter tools for conservation standards. So that was kind of our first step into just canvassing this community to see what the demand and what the products might be needed. And here you'll see we just started to pull together some of these resources, drawing from many different organizations and the work that's already been done. Lighter conservation standards is not a new concept. We recognize that several coaches, several organizations have already tried to pull together resources that basically do the same thing. So we want to better understand those efforts and ideally learn lessons from those and build upon those resources. And you can see here the example on the left, or it's just a snapshot of a table of how we've compiled those resources. And we've even had conversations with people like Phyllis Ratchler at WWF, who've really spearheaded this effort within WWF and sort of picked her brain about what lessons she's learned along the way. We also sought input from this community using two sort of focus group style discussions, where we gathered 23 individuals across both of those sessions and really had an open conversation about what kind of lighter conservation standards options would be useful, and what people are looking for, really. And in the process of those conversations, we set up a number of different scenarios. So what kind of scenarios do conservation teams find themselves in that might warrant a lighter touch approach? And then how would you go about coaching a lighter approach in those scenarios? So we teed up those scenarios, got feedback from the group on how we could approach those scenarios in a lighter way. And then we also proposed some potential tools or products coming out of these sessions, and did a bit of a voting exercise. And there was pretty clear consensus over what tools and products might be useful, and maybe some that might be better for later on down the road. So here's a list of what was brainstormed in terms of products that would be useful. It's a pretty long list, but we were able to hone in on basically the top three priorities here. The one on the top is what we're calling an orientation chart, but that's essentially mapping out a set of scenarios that adequately describe sort of the breadth of scenarios that conservation teams find themselves in. It's not an exhaustive list of scenarios, but it's hopefully representative of, yeah, just the varied kind of ways in which the conservation standards are applied. And in those scenarios, really honing in on what are the bare minimums, what are the essentials, and where could you perhaps take shortcuts or cut corners without losing too much of the rigor or the integrity of the conservation standards. So that's one product that's at the top there. The second one is an easy conservation standards workbook that takes those different scenarios and really highlights what those bare minimum elements are, and really provides clear direction and guidance for how to implement lighter CS under those scenarios. And then finally, there was demand for further down the list here, some tip sheets that are 1 to 3 page, really short guides that highlight the most important elements of a process, a step, or a tool, and provide some quick how-to reference and guidance for teams. So getting back to the idea of the scenarios and the orientation chart, you can see in the top middle there, that's just a screenshot of this orientation chart where, again, we've listed several different scenarios, and they're listed here actually in bullets, where a team could be developing a full conservation plan for ecosystem or species, or perhaps a thematic one. A team could be in a scenario where they're trying to get a wide range of stakeholders to share a common plan, a scenario to provide or promote policy adoption. Maybe a team's in a pause and adapt process, or they're working with an existing strategy and when wanting to develop a monitoring plan. Maybe they're in a scenario where they're trying to identify the best indicators for their targets, or they want to go full cycle and just really do the bare bones in conservation standards, or they're trying to generate interest in the process. Excuse me, 1 second. It's cold season up in the UK, so pardon me, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold myself. So again, for those scenarios, we've outlined which elements, which steps and sub-steps of the conservation standards are really must-have, potentially would be helpful, or which could potentially be skipped, and then what do you stand to lose from skipping it. So with those scenarios in mind and the orientation chart, we started to develop some products. And as we were developing products, we really started to find the analogy to a cookbook really helpful, really useful. And as you all know, those of you who are cooks, you have a cookbook and you have a recipe for a dish that you're trying to make. And you might be in various circumstances where you're cooking for vegetarians, or you're limited on time, or you don't have all the ingredients you might need, a cookbook and a skilled chef or cook, pardon me, can modify a recipe as needed to sort of meet their circumstances. We wanted to carry that analogy forward into this lighter conservation standards and start to develop products kind of building on that analogy. Sorry guys, I'm going to go on mute and get a cough drop. I'll be back.
Okay, no problem. So hopefully Vinaya will be back in a moment. If not, then I'll carry on through. But yeah, just to say, just on the different scenarios. So Vinaya, I'm not sure whether you put it on the screen there, but there is a bit of a spreadsheet there which actually shows how you might actually use different steps, the different steps through. Yeah. So I know that some people actually the other day, even that they found that quite interesting and useful. Some of you again may have contributed to the so some of the inputs on this as to what's a really important step, or could you potentially skip something or do it in a lighter way. So again, so just across the top there are various different scenarios, and you can just see some of the sub-steps there, what some people were thinking or what users seem to be thinking about what might be most important to include or might not be so crucial. And so it is just about coming into a situation, maybe as a team or a user or as a coach, and just thinking, okay, what sort of situation are we in? What are the needs? And therefore, where should we focus our efforts right now, rather than thinking that it's all got to be the same way. Vinaya, how are you doing?
I'm okay. Sorry about that. Struggling
No
over
bother.
here. I think I can manage though. Thanks for reminding me to share that spreadsheet there. Okay. Back to the recipe analogy, I wanted to just share a couple of mock-ups we've developed building on that analogy as to what those scenarios, those components of the lighter CS workbook might look like. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but if you have comments, reactions, or questions, please note them, because we're about to go into breakout rooms and have a discussion on these mock-ups. So you'll have plenty of time to note down any reactions or comments or questions. Go ahead and note them down as I'm walking through. You'll have time in the breakout to really discuss them in detail. Okay, so first up, we have this mock-up where we've really run with that recipe analogy and created what kind of looks like a recipe card, where you have the scenario at the top. So in this mock-up, in this example, we're focusing on the reflect and adapt step in step 4 of the conservation standards. Then at the left here, the scenario itself is described in a little bit more detail. So under what conditions or circumstances might you find yourself in this step? And then there is a very brief set of directions under that, basically highlighting the bare minimum that your team should really do. And then at the right, you have these ingredients. Basically, what are those key sub-steps that you really don't want to overlook for this particular scenario? So if you're reflecting and adapting, you really want your theory of change to reflect back upon so that you can review your project assumptions. You certainly want to have data analysis so that you can reflect on some monitoring data. You want to make adaptations in light of what those data are saying. And then you want to document your learning outputs and what decisions you made based on the reflect and adapt process. So the ingredients over here on the right, those of you who are well attuned to the color scheme of the conservation standards may note that the color coding aligns to the steps in the conservation standards. So theories of change, step 2, data analysis and adaptations, step 4, and then learning outputs, step 5. You see the color coding also carries forward to the directions, those bullet points on the left there. And the idea behind these ingredients is that each of those rectangles is a link. It's a button that you can click on in order to get to one of the tip sheets, those 1 to 3 page quick guides, quick how-to guides of here's how you do this sub-step, here's what's really important, here's what you potentially stand to lose if you take shortcuts. So this is kind of a one-stop landing page where you have a summary of the scenario, but then you can access those tip sheets over there on the right through the ingredients list. That's one mock-up. Another mock-up looks like this. It's kind of not so reliant on that recipe analogy. This is a bit more straightforward, where you have your step at the top, the scenario at the top described, and then you have the sub-steps that are the minimum ingredients or minimum components of that scenario and that step. And these are more clearly aligned to steps in the conservation standard. So you can very clearly see that theory of change is linked to the planning step, analysis and adaptation to, of course, the analyze and adapt step, and then the learning insights to the share step. And then we have just a visual to kind of illustrate what the scenario or what the end product could look like. It's just meant to be yeah, an illustration of what this scenario is and what you stand to gain from it. So in this mock-up, you have a picture of a conservation team doing a reflect and adapt workshop and using their theory of change up on the wall and marking it up using sticky notes as they reflect back on their implementation. Again, these buttons here are hyperlinks, and actually I will exit out of this quickly to show you what this looks like. So if I click on this theory of change, this right now takes me to a different slide in the slide deck, but in reality, this would take you out to probably a PDF or a website or some platform where these tip sheets are going to reside. So what these tip sheets will include are, again, kind of an orientation to where you are in the conservation standards. So with theories of change, you're in step 2, the plan step. Goes into a little bit of detail about what a theory of change is, what that particular step is. Then will include some considerations of when you might want to use a theory of change, and what you stand to lose by shortcutting or sidestepping this particular sub-step. And it'll also include some basics of how to go about developing a theory of change, using some tips and guidance, and really some clues on how to do that in a quick way. Which would include, of course, criteria for what is a good theory of change in this example. So that was a brief detour just to show what the tip sheets are going to include. They're not going to necessarily be slides in a slide deck, but these are the components of what might go into a tip sheet. Going back up to this reflect and adapt mockup, I mentioned that the image here is meant to be just sort of illustrative of what that scenario and what that step will give you. In this mockup, this is more a realistic picture of what that looks like. The next mockup, it's the same, everything is the same except for the image. And the image in this case is a little bit more symbolic and less of a picture of people working around a table at a workshop. So those are kind of two versions of the same mock-up. One that's more symbolic, maybe a little more inspirational. Another one is a bit more realistic. So what we're asking you to do now is to give us your inputs and share your thoughts on what I've just presented to you. And in order to do that, we're going to split into 2 breakouts, and we're going to start by just taking a moment for all of you to individually look at those slides that I just presented and use the same tool that we used at the introduction that Will walked us through to make your comments. So on each slide, there are going to be numbered bubbles that you can drag to the relevant part of your slide. And then you use the corresponding number down in the speaker's notes, so down below on the slide, to add your comment or your thought. I walked through that really quickly, so we're going to give you a good 10 minutes, 15 if you need it, to individually look at those slides on your own, provide your comments, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. We have a good hour for this conversation, so hopefully that'll be sufficient to really get your input, and feel free to be very candid, pick apart these mock-ups as best as you can. This is really our chance to solicit input and be able to tailor these products in a way that will better suit this community and respond to what you all need. So really looking forward to your input. Before we break into groups, are there any questions?
Okay, fine. So thank you very much, Vinaya. I will put us into breakout groups in a moment. I'm just going to pause the recording. Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, great. Huishim, I hope you don't mind my sharing your thought, which I found very helpful and interesting. Huishim mentioned or pointed out that none of the scenarios we outlined in our orientation chart and in these mock-ups included working with a team that is focused on climate mitigation or adaptation or emissions reductions. And I don't know about everybody, but I'm certainly working with more and more projects that have not just a biodiversity component, but also a climate component as well. So I thought that was a really helpful suggestion to maybe come up with the scenario that addresses climate as well as kind of our strict biodiversity conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Huishim, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you captured it. I mean, like basically, yeah, I mean, like, I guess especially if it's just sort of emission reduction, you know, for example, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, actually, I just sort of created a conceptual model in the last couple of days. Yeah, I mean, I find it quite sort of futile to try and develop a sort of, I mean, the drivers and all that. I mean, like, we're not, I mean, in this case, we're not going to address a lot of the drivers. So spending time, you know, identifying all the drivers may not be all that useful. I mean, like, a lot of these are actually, you know, I mean, historical, right? I mean, yeah. So I mean, like, some of these drivers, I mean, like, for policy project, you know, they may still be working on this kind of drivers, but for, like, you know, sort of restoration project for carbon credits, you know, it's yeah, it's not so relevant. Yeah, so I guess it has, it really depends on the type of climate change projects as well, and more and more, I mean, wide and wider range, you know, I mean, like, yeah, financing as well, you know, this is another type of project, but I guess that's similar to policy type of projects as well, you know, yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it relates very much to an area which we have kind of got on the scenarios, but it would need to be teased out a lot, which is the more thematic types. How do we, when you're speaking to different thematic types of work, or just whether it's landscape, geographic, thematic based, some combination, what sort of scale it is, all of those more, if you like, technical characteristics lead to a whole variety of approaches that you might want to be able to support people on and accelerate them through, particularly by finding similar examples. That's obviously one of the key things. A lot of what we provide, of course, is quite generic sometimes, and instead we could help, or in addition, we could help accelerate people's development of strategies by providing good comparable examples along a similar theme, which would help people along. So we've kind of captured it, but that could be developed out considerably if we really get into it. Any other major comments, and then we'll just start to move on to the last bit, the wrap up.
Yes, please.
Sure, Jorge.
No, only following my comment about how to share the different approaches that we have on conservation. So we have realized that it's really important because, for example, we have to explain our conservation plan to the Board of Trustees. So we need this type of approaches. So approaches with a lot of work behind, but we need products to show or different ways to show the other people working on the organizations, financials, communication people, and so on. So because when we begin to talk about this, well, this is my objective, this is my target, this is smart for they open a lot the eyes, but we have realized that it's really important to have different approaches to be shown depending on the target audience.
And Jorge, do you have things on that already that you haven't shared yet with the group that help to explain to those other functions?
Yeah, we now we have moved from the results change to theories of change, and finally to obtain only talking about a strategic plan. It's not a project, it's the whole strategic plan of the WWF Spain. So we have created a PowerPoint to show all of our strategy to be explained to the Board of Trustees or so on.
Other audiences. Okay, I mean, if there's something you'd like to share with the group, that would be great. Thank you. Or you can do that via me or direct to.
I have the first draft. We are working on it.
Okay, fine. But it's a really good point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Any other major comments? All right, that's fine. Well, thank you very much for those inputs. It's been super helpful. So maybe Vinay, if we could just go to the next steps slide and just explain to people what we will do going forward then. So clearly the group will be taking forward, looking at all of the inputs that we received. It's been really rich. And as I say, we had a big group the other day as well that gave a lot of other inputs as well. We'll be looking at all that together. Some of it, of course, is in different directions, but there is quite a lot of actually, I would say, Vinaya, quite a lot of consensus in terms of general feel. I think actually in terms of just to give one example, generally speaking, I think people quite liked the slide 2 option in terms of the recipe option. They generally quite like the recipe analogy. They quite like the slide 2 presentation of that with perhaps some adjustments. So just that's an example of where there's been quite a lot of consensus. But there is, as I say, lots of other rich feedback as well. So we'll look at the feedback received at the rally and basically the group will work to integrate that in products. And then ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, that this will go through with some proper reviews as well. But a lot of it is going to be about how people use and pick this up. And I hope it's been quite helpful for you to start giving you some ideas as to what you might like to pick up for use in the future. So it'll be, yes, early in 2022 when product use ought to be available for people to start picking up and using. And it'll be a continuous process of feedback beyond there. Then maybe if we can get the resources and investments or just energy from the community, future efforts to continuously improve this or take big further steps on this initiative in future. But let's see where we get to. If you really like this initiative, then be enthusiastic, support it, and hopefully it will have a long and evolving life and give us some really useful product for the future. Okay, so I think we're kind of towards the end there. Vinay, have you got any final comments you'd like to bring? And then we'll just point people to this evaluation form.
Just a thank you, and please be on the lookout for additional opportunities to weigh in and comment on these products as they continue to take shape.
Brilliant, thank you. So Vinay, maybe you could just tee up the link to the evaluation form in the chat, and if people could click on that just to give us a really quick evaluation, that'd be helpful. But other than that, I guess on this session we are done, and thank you very much to everybody for your inputs. It's been really good, and we will speak to you again soon. Just leave you there doing the evaluation form if you wouldn't mind. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Nice to
Thank
see
you, everyone.
everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.